Great. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us this afternoon, this evening, I guess it is now, for this workshop on egg safety and best practices, and for our allergen control program development section too. So my name is Jess. I work with Blue Ridge Women in Agriculture. We're a nonprofit based in Boone that focuses on serving farmers and producers around the high country through our multiple farmers markets, our high country food hub, which is an online farmers market. And then we also run a couple of other programs like our local food is medicine and double up food bucks programs, which are food access related. And we also run a Blue Ridge Craft workshop and like farmer events and outreach program. So that's what this workshop is a part of as part of our winter workshop series. It's actually the last workshop in the series. So we'll be announcing our spring and summer workshops pretty soon here. So stay tuned for those. But the purpose of this workshop is to go over some of our best food safety practices for eggs and for meat and for controlling allergens, in particular in regards to the Farms Share program. So Conna Miller is here from CFSA to talk a little bit about that. We've also got Sara Runkel from CFSA, who's going to talk about the allergen control program. And then we're also fortunate to have Eddy Labus here from Watauga County Agricultural Extension, who's going to talk a little bit about egg safety best practices. And his name is Jess McClellan on this too, but that is Eddy. So you know how it is, technical things, Zoom. It's great. So I will just go ahead and hand things over to Conna, and feel free if you guys have any questions, just chime in, drop any questions in the chat. We'll be sharing a notes document with all of this information afterwards. Any links that we talk about today, any resources, we'll link that so y'all can access them afterwards. One housekeeping thing, I do have a quick survey for y'all all to take before you leave. So I'll drop that link in the chat. And if y'all have to head out early for some reason, please make sure you just take that real quick. It helps us continue to do events like these and improve them and continue to make resources available. So thanks so much. And I know I said I was going to hand it over to Conna earlier, but I'm going to actually do that now. Conna, could you share a little bit about Farms Share with us?
Yeah,
Jess,
absolutely.
do you want to make me before we get started, do you want to
yeah.
make me a host and I can
I'll go ahead and make you a host. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, yeah, thanks, Jess. And thanks y'all for joining us this evening. Yeah, so I'm Conna Miller. I'm the local food distribution coordinator with Carolina Farm Stewardship Association, and I manage our Farm Share program. And Farm Share is a program that probably a lot of you might be working with or interacting with, and you might not realize you've been interacting with or working with this program. Farm Share was started by CFSA in 2020 in response to the pandemic and as a way to increase access to our, the wealth of locally grown foods that we have here in North Carolina, and get it out to households that needed food. So when the program first started, it was responding to farmers losing markets, restaurants shutting down, farmers markets shutting down, and needing somewhere for their product to go. And also the sort of surge of restaurants that had to let employees go. And so there was a whole group of underemployed restaurant and hospitality employees. And so we started this network called Farm Share to source that local food from farmers, pay them a fair wage for that product, and then distribute boxes of food to underemployed restaurant and hospitality employees. Since 2020, the program has grown and really expanded and is continuing to provide that network support of sourcing from local farmers through our food hub partners like High Country Food Hub, and then distribute these boxes out to we expanded who the boxes are going to now, and now our food is going out to just folks experiencing food insecurity, families, households, individuals. And so our hope with the Farm Share program is to continue growing it and building on the success we've had over the past 3 years, and hopefully set it up as a local food system model that shows how to align and sort of bring a network of food hubs, small sustainable farms like yourselves, and community-based organizations to aggregate local foods and distribute them out into the communities. And so that's what FarmShare is. And this year, we received funding through the USDA and the North Carolina Department of Agriculture through a grant program called Local Food Purchase Cooperative Agreement Program, which is a bit of a mouthful. It's also known as LFPA for short. So you might hear us sort of refer to LFPA, FarmShare, refer to those two things in the same breath sometimes. And so with this LFPA funding, we will be able to continue supporting this network over the next 2 years. So for 2023 and 2024, expand the reach and expand our purchasing power a little bit with this program. And so this is expanding the network across North Carolina. We're partnering with High Country Food Hub for this, in addition to 13 other food hub partners across the state, so 14 food hubs total. And actually, Sarah, if you want to go to the next slide. Yeah, so this slide just sort of shows that vast network of FarmShare. And so with this LFPA funding in 2023, we are adding a few additional program requirements and guidelines to just help shore up the program a little bit in response to this grant funding and just the increased nature and capacity of this program. And so with this webinar this evening, we hope to just kind of zoom in a little bit on an aspect of our food safety requirements for the program. We have some pretty basic food safety requirements for producers selling into the program, which Sarah is going to discuss in depth. But with this training, we're hoping to kind of look at if you are handling allergens, which is one of the food safety components we're looking at for our requirements, best practices for how to reduce risk with those. So thank you. And if you've been selling into this program, maybe you knew it, maybe you didn't, but thank you for contributing some amazing local food to the FarmShare program. I'll pass it back to you, Sarah.
Okay, thanks, Kana. All right, so before we jump into talking about allergen controls, I thought it'd be good to do some quick introductions in the chat so that we get an idea of who is participating in the webinar. And so if you can, in the chat, just share where you farm, and if you grow produce, if you raise eggs, or if you raise any other crops or livestock. That would be awesome. I'm trying to see if anybody else is in the waiting.
And Sarah, do we also want folks to share their name as well?
Yeah, you can share your name in the chat.
Okay.
Usually your name shows up on the
Oh yeah,
but
that's true.
Nice. Shenanigan Farms. I like that name. And was anybody at the food safety workshop we did at High Country Food Hub? This would have been mid-February. So that workshop really focused on all of the food safety requirements for selling into the FarmShare program and was geared primarily towards fruit and vegetable growers. And one aspect of the food safety requirements is related to managing allergens and the risk of food allergens on the farm. And so we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive into the risks associated with allergens on the farm and why you should be concerned about them, and just give you a better understanding of like if this applies to your farm. So it looks like most of the folks on here are do eggs and some vegetables and maybe some other row crops, some meat producers. So this should apply to most of you that are participating tonight. So. All right. So one of the requirements for selling into farm share is completing a grower questionnaire, and this questionnaire will be sent out through the Food Hub. So High Country Food Hub will be sending out this questionnaire, but it's a questionnaire that was developed by CFSA, and CFSA is collecting all the responses to it. And there are a number of questions on that questionnaire, but there are 6 that need to have a yes answer in order to sell into farm share. And then there's some additional questions related to other food safety practices on the farm that we want to get a feel for where people might need help implementing some of those practices. With that said, if any of those first 6 questions, if you do answer no, that doesn't mean you're automatically cut off from the program. We will work with you to help you get up to speed to be able to implement those practices so that you can sell into farm share. The food safety requirements are really entry level, and our goal is to help folks implement some food safety practices because of this increased funding and the increased scope of the program, but also because of the audience that this program is serving across the state, tend to be a higher risk population. So food safety risks are definitely a concern when serving those clients. So the question that we're going to focus on tonight, as it relates to food safety, is about allergens. And so one of the questions on the questionnaire is, do you handle allergens on the farm? Well, what does that mean, right? So in this case, we're really focused on food allergens, and specifically the top 9. So these have been identified as the biggest food allergens. They account for 90% of all food allergies in the United States. And so we want to be really aware if we are handling any of these products on the farm in addition to our produce, and we'll talk about risks of cross contact and potential risks of cross contamination. So lots of people are affected by food allergies, and they can cause mild symptoms or even life-threatening symptoms. So if you do handle any of these on the farm, so if you're an egg producer, or if we don't have a lot of peanut producers up here in the western part of the state, but there are down east, but tree nuts, so think of like hazelnuts or walnuts, pecans. If you're handling any wheat products, soy, well, you can see all of the different allergens. So the first question is, do you handle any of these allergens? And then if you do, you need to have an allergen control program in place. And so what we're going to do tonight is talk through what it means to develop an allergen control program. And we're going to give you some time to actually make some notes and think about how you would identify risks related to allergens and then implement some practices to reduce those risks. All right, I'm just checking to make sure no one's in the waiting room. I disabled the waiting room, Jeff, so if anybody joins, they can jump in.
And Sarah, I'll keep an eye on the chat for you in case any questions slide in.
Okay, that sounds great. So as we go through these slides and thinking about an allergen control program, we're going to list the allergens that are in use or storage on the farm. And then if you do have any, we're going to think through the procedures to address identification and segregation of those allergens during storage and handling from the other products on your farm. Typically, we're worried about fruits and vegetables But if you're producing any of these, you need to be aware of the risks associated with them. So while we have this slide up, hopefully folks have a pen and paper handy, or can take notes somewhere, but just jot down if you handle any of these on the farm, because the first step of an allergen control program is to identify the allergens that you might have on the farm. Okay. All right, so let's just talk briefly about why allergens are a concern. So in the produce safety world, allergens are considered a chemical contaminant. So within produce safety, we're concerned about all different sorts of contamination of fruits and vegetables. So microbiological contamination is one that we talk a lot about, and bacteria, viruses, parasites that can make people sick. Physical contaminants, so think about like broken glass or metal shards or splinters that might be in your produce, or staples, and then chemical contaminants. And so often folks think of like pesticide residue or sanitizer residue, but allergens are also considered a chemical contaminant. And they are an issue because there are a lot of people in the United States that have food allergies. So according to the USDA, food allergies affect about 2% of adults and 4 to 8% of children in the United States. And it's estimated that anaphylaxis to food results in 30,000 emergency room visits, 2,000 hospitalizations, and 150 deaths. So this is across the country. If you yourself have a food allergy or have any family members or friends who have food allergies, you're probably aware of the lengths that people go to be aware of, what's in their food, trying to avoid any sort of cross contact so that they aren't affected by those allergens. On the farm, cross contact can happen relatively easily if you're handling any of these allergens and other products on the farm. So for example, egg producers, right? So if you're cleaning or grating eggs, if you're using a sink and also using it for produce, which hopefully you're not doing that, but any sort of risk of that, like contamination of the produce from the food contact surface that has contacted eggs, especially if any of the eggs break. Also think about like storage of maybe used egg cartons versus, if you're packaging materials for your produce. Coolers, so walk-in coolers, refrigeration, right? So thinking about the risks associated with maybe eggs breaking, contaminating produce, or cheese or dairy products that might be improperly stored. And then for a lot of small farms, and I think, this applies to like the boxes that the Food Hub is packing as well. But if you have a CSA, think about like, if you're handling any products that are these allergens in addition to your produce for your CSA. So whether you're like co-packing stuff, this is an example of a CSA share that has bread, and the bread is, packaged individually and labeled, but, if that dust were to get out, right, is there a risk of cross contact there? And the risk with food contact surfaces. So you can also think about like harvesting equipment. If you're harvesting any grains or nuts that are allergens, and then using that equipment for your produce. And then, last but not least, we can also be, and our workers can be, a potential source of cross-contact contamination. If we're eating a peanut butter and jelly sandwich for lunch and we don't wash our hands properly before packing produce, right? So, part of basic food safety practices is to implement, good hand washing procedures for everyone working with produce. So hand washing should be addressed for multiple reasons, but allergens is just another reason to make sure that folks are washing their hands properly and aware of what the risks are. So how can we prevent cross contact on the farm? There are multiple ways that you can have unintentional harm due to allergen cross contact. So the first step is really to identify all of those allergens that are present on the farm, providing appropriate food safety training for any workers on the farm, and this includes volunteers, family members, really anybody who's handling produce that might also be interacting with the allergens. Implementing good handling practices and emphasizing the importance of allergen control, good cleaning and sanitizing procedures, making sure you have hand washing stations, separate packing, processing, and storage areas for allergens. So we'll talk about storage here in a little bit. Signage, and then designated break areas and places where workers can store their personal food away from your product. And then having some sort of segregation and transport. So whether that's like a separate cooler for your eggs or your other, your bread, so that it's separated out and there's no risk of cross contact happening during transportation. So as we go through the next few slides, I'm going to give you a few minutes to write down your answers to the questions that we're going to talk through. But I really want you to think about, like, what is the potential identified risk? So you've already identified the allergens that might be present on your farm. So we're going to talk about like storage, signage issues. So what's the potential risk? And then what action are you going to take to minimize that risk? Whether it's a preventative action up front, or if there were to be cross contact, like what kind of corrective action would you take to either remove that contaminated product from distribution, or that's probably the best thing, but then how are you going to like clean up if there is a spill or some sort of cross contact issue? And that's really what's going to make up your allergen control program. So we don't have a template. It's not super complicated, and we don't require you to have this program in a certain format. It's really just making sure that you're aware of what the risks are and how you're going to manage them. So the first one is, do you have designated storage areas for all allergens? So this is a shelf picture from a commercial kitchen. It's maybe not representative of what you would see necessarily in a farm's walk-in cooler, but you can see they've got like these bags of peanuts, like everything's kind of all mixed together. It doesn't look super organized, but think about your cooler and how you're storing, like if you have eggs and produce, do you have a separate fridge that you store your eggs on? Do you have a separate shelf in the cooler? Where is that shelf located in relation to your produce? And are there other allergens that you might be storing in the cooler as well, or even in dry storage like room temperature storage? So think about your storage. What are the potential risks? And then what are you going to do to minimize that risk, either by separating out your eggs or allergen storage, or making sure your shelving is not next to, directly adjacent to produce or above your produce where it might contaminate the product. So I'm going to give you guys some uncomfortable silence while you jot down some notes. It's especially hard when I can't see anybody's faces. See if okay. Does anybody have any questions about this? Feel free to unmute yourself too. Not seeing anything in the chat. Okay, so now the next question is about signage. So if you do have separate storage for your allergens, do you have signage to designate that that is an area for allergens only, right? So, you know, this is where the bread gets stored, or this is where our soybean meal gets stored, separate from, you know, where we store any of our packaging for our produce. Or even potentially, you know, on an egg operation, right? You might use feed that has allergens in it. And how do you separate that? Like soy is a different allergen than eggs. And so keeping that separate from where you store your egg cartons would be a good practice so that you're not contaminating your packaging with another allergen. So again, what's the potential risk? Do you not have signage? In which case the preventative action would be to create some signage. Okay. And then the last question relates back to storage as well. So this is both for cold storage and like room temperature ambient storage. Are you storing all your allergens below non-allergens? So on the left here, you know, this is a consumer picture, but just think of this scaled up for a produce cooler, right? Like you wouldn't want your cartons of eggs directly next to your lettuce, right? There are multiple reasons. Allergens is one, but you know, eggs can carry salmonella, so we've got microbiological contamination as well. And then on the right here, you know, if you do reuse containers, how do you store those so that they're not a potential contaminant of your packaging material for your produce or other items? So this is a picture from High Country Food Hub. So they've got their egg containers below the wax boxes where they're that they're keeping for reuse. So again, you know, think about your current situation. Can you identify any potential risks with how you're currently storing allergens? And then what will you do to minimize that risk? Yeah, Bethany.
Hey, just had a quick question. I was wondering if you guys thought that storing your new egg cartons with used egg cartons would be some kind of cross contamination.
I don't think it really matters for allergens, right? Because they're both new and used are going to have eggs in them, but you do want to think about like microbiological contamination, which is kind of another topic. And I think Eddy's going to talk about this a little bit, but you know, if you reuse egg cartons, they need to be clean. You know, you can't like sanitize them, but they can't be visibly dirty, right? So you don't want to have like egg cartons that have had poopy eggs in them, to be blunt, right? Or like broken eggs, right? Those should get discarded. But I think for allergen purposes, storing new ones next to ones you're saving isn't an issue.
So Sarah, would you recommend reusing eggs that's post-consumer that may have been contaminated that you have no idea of, and what would be liability in that case?
So my understanding, according to North Carolina egg law, is that there's no restriction to using egg cartons as long as they're not visibly contaminated. But
not from
Eddy brings up a
contamination.
good point that you can't see all contamination, right? Like you can't see salmonella contamination. So there's definitely risk, potential risk there, but you know, you as a producer need to decide how you're going to manage that risk. And people store their egg cartons in all sorts of ways in between when they empty out the egg carton and they finally get it back to you. So Has it been like rolling around in the back of their car for the past month until they get it to you? Do they keep them in the pantry where the cat litter box is too? You know, like there's no telling how people store their containers in between use. So definitely something to be aware of. And Eddy, if you have further advice, please chime in.
Well, I was going to talk about this more, but for me, post-consumer packaging like that brings lots of liability to you. And the next person you sell that to, you assume 100% of liability. And I know Food Hub just did or are doing a new bulk egg carton. I think I've seen them, they're less than 7 or 8 cents if you're buying some really bulk or buying flats. And I'll talk a little bit more about the contamination from a different standpoint. But as you were talking, Sarah, it just hit me that, well, if they make their smoothie at home and a yogurt splashes on it or peanut butter, and then it goes back and they're not allergic to eggs, but they're allergic to that, then it creates an actual allergen concern. And a lot of people like these fresh eggs to store on their counter and they leave that carton sitting there. So I think as a producer, I would just be really thinking about, okay, where do you source all these egg cartons from? Because most of them coming from a grocery store somewhere, so you have no control over that. Second, building that reputation of food safety, and I'll cover that just a little bit more, but just from an allergen standpoint, maybe labeling who it's going to, and the same eggs are going back to that person, or communicating with who you're selling to about handling that. I've seen them come in all kinds of different bags and all kinds of different situations. So just think of that as a small.
Yeah. Oh. Thanks, Eddy. Great point. So those are really the questions you need to ask yourself for an allergen control program. So it's not super complicated. So hopefully you guys have taken notes throughout the past 10 minutes, right? And so now you have an allergen control program. So really it's like identifying the allergens, figuring out your storage, making sure you're not storing that you're storing all your allergen products below things that aren't allergens. So like even with like meat isn't, there's much lower incidences of people being allergic to meat than there are to the top 9 that we discussed, right? And so like even if you had a refrigerator or cooler that was dedicated to like meat products and eggs, right? Like you'd want to store your eggs below any meat products. And then having some signage to designate those separate allergen storage areas. So how do people feel? Do you want a little bit more time to write down your thoughts? We have plenty of time. So I know talking to Jess, our hope for this workshop is that you would come away from this feeling like you had an allergen control program, if that is necessary for your farm, and that you've identified the allergens that are an issue on your farm. I'm going to give you guys like 2 minutes. That seems good. Since we've had some time throughout this, I don't know. Unmute yourself or put something in the chat. I can't see your faces if you're frowning or you're diligently writing away. So.
Sarah, there's a message from Nora. Did you see that?
Yes, but it's
Yeah.
been clear. Yes.
Yes. Well done.
Great. You might want to edit this part out of the Zoom recording, Jess.
Yeah, I can. Well, if nobody objects, I think we can probably continue.
Yeah.
Great, thanks.
And then we can take some time at the end too, like we have plenty of time. So, and then I also just want to share my contact information. So if anybody has questions about allergens or just general food safety on the farm, please reach out. So I am providing support to growers selling into farm share across North Carolina, and can help folks as they need it. So, you know, if you need some additional information related to the grower questionnaire or implementing any practices on the farm, please reach out. And for those of you that are in the Boone area, I just live over in Mitchell County, so I'm not too far away. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing and we'll turn it over to Eddie.
Good evening. I think I know some of you that's on here. I think I've been to your farm. Is anybody that is selling eggs over 30 dozen a week? If you are, just say yes, raise your hand, something other. Because really what I'm talking about is under 30 dozen per week. And I've got a link I'll share with Jess. I'm not the most computer savvy and I'm on a touch mouse and I can't get it to cut and paste to share the link. But there's a really good at NC State on the egg law that breaks it down and makes it very simple. Is anybody grading eggs? Okay. And so you all are falling under, you know, the under 30 dozen, and you do not have to grade your eggs. However, your eggs must be clean. Now, does that mean you need to wash your eggs? No. But if there is any kind of residue, whether that be a feather, a piece of bedding, or manure, you need to have those clean. And so there is a proper washing procedure to wash those off. And I would be happy to share that. It's not covered under the egg laws right now. And so I will find that and make sure to share that with Jess so that it'll be on the links tomorrow. So ungraded eggs need to be labeled as with your name, where these eggs were produced, the address of the producer, and you must have the word eggs and how many's on there. You're not allowed to put fresh. And so if you're reusing containers and it says fresh eggs on them, really you would be in violation of the law unless you grade them as a grade A. So reusing packaging under the label, you need to put something on it that covers up what that previous farm had on there so that it is blank. The Julian date is not necessarily needed, Chris, but a date. So if you're using the Julian date, make sure that you're keeping records that that's what you're using if there was ever a case. But making sure you're covering that up, because if it says grade A eggs and you didn't grade those eggs, like I say, that's a violation. Having the word eggs on there meets all your allergen there shouldn't be any kind of cross contamination if you're following good practices, and that's really what we want you doing. And I'll kind of leave it there with the allergen and the labeling. Anybody that would like a follow-up or want me to come to their farm, I would be more than willing to do that and go over it with you. And we had a nice egg workshop. The Food Hub and I last year with Lauren Green came up last year and a half ago after COVID, it all runs together. But we went over grading and what freshness looks like. And so I want to kind of come back to the producer side of that, what you're doing before you're packaging eggs, before you're selling eggs, and from a food safety standpoint. The only food safety concern that I'm aware of coming from a local farm in the high country was at a restaurant making a hollandaise sauce using local fresh eggs. And several people became sickened from it. And so I got to experience a lot of that going back to the farm, trying to trace everything back, and we could never find, the conclusion is that salmonella was in the eggs weren't cooked to the proper temperature, and that was the cause. I don't think anything ever went further than that. But from that food safety standpoint, first of all, if you're having dirty eggs, especially more than 1 or 2%, then I think you need to look at your housing of your birds and your laying boxes. That is very important. I like a laying box that is slanted, that the eggs roll out and has no bedding in it, for 2 reasons. It keeps your eggs very clean. It keeps your hens from setting on the eggs, and snakes don't like to get your eggs as much either in a wire-bottomed lay box or a metal-bottomed lay box. So, think of that. If you're having birds that are roosting near where they lay, many times you'll get some cross-contamination because they'll, as the ladies are all waiting for their favorite box, they mill around inside the house, they pick manure up on their feet, and then that gets transferred. Being an egg producer, you probably have one of the roughest jobs of food safety from a standpoint of keeping that clean. Now, the other thing I noticed in the bios I was reading and the farms I'm familiar with, several of you have other livestock, and I know we all like to let our birds out and, forage through the manure of other livestock. But realizing in doing that you need to have cleanliness, because other livestock carry salmonella and other things that when we see 2 species commingled like that, we can see certain diseases go up. Many of those are zoological to us. And so from a food safety standpoint, this time of year, your chicken run, if it's muddy, just as any other livestock producer, you need to have alternatives or a run that is completely bedded or graveled that you can keep clean. And some of these are reasons, and I always like to say why we are where we are, but this is where we have seen the industry go indoors, is really from a food safety and an animal safety standpoint. And so I think as producers on the small farm, we have to do a really good job and be aware of those things, making sure your birds right now, you're aware of avian influenza and you're not feeding wild birds. So if you're having hummingbird feeders up and you're having, songbird feeders up, remove those from your farm and don't put them up anymore, because you don't want to attract migratory fowl to your farm. If you have a pond and you're having migratory fowl coming in, keeping your chickens under roof, 24 hours a day until migratory season is over, I think is essential. And that's really the reason we've seen the increase in egg prices and the decrease. It's affect our layer industry tremendously. These birds takes a lot longer than broilers to repopulate. Is there any questions on eggs or poultry safety? And I know that's quick. I'm doing a backyard poultry class I'm trying to get together right now. And then in conjunction with ASU, Dr. Fanatico will be doing a boiler workshop also sometime this summer. So watch for that, and we'll share it with the Food Hub and Bria. Any questions, just go ahead and put them in the chat or raise your hand. So I want to talk a little bit about meat and allergens. And when Sarah and Jess asked me to do this, I'm like, I don't really know much about this. And so I went out to the local butchery and I'm like, what do you guys do about allergens? And so they talked to me and we kind of, they're like, we don't really do that. And so I got to searching. I talked to Lee Meanius with NC Choices, and he says, any producer that is having anything processed, you don't need to worry about allergen labeling. Now, I don't mean that as it doesn't need to be on your radar, but the HACCP plan of your processor covers you, and they are required by law to put any kind of allergen labeling that is required. The only time that would come into play is if you're selling further processed products, being some of the summer sausages that may have cheese or something added to them, or fresh sausages that may use a dairy-based powder or a soy base as part of the ingredient list. So there can be many of these allergens that come out into that. So make sure that you're aware. And if you go to your processor, if you want to have something on file, I think most of them would say, okay, give me a couple weeks or a month and I'll find that part, of my HACCP plan. I wouldn't push them too much on it because they're all super busy. And legally, you guys can't be making any kind of sausage or processing further at home and then selling that product. So it would be, if you're doing that, you're already in violation of the law. But any secondary producer that is FDA, USDA inspected will have that as part of their food safety plan. And I'll make sure that, Sarah has my contact information. If anybody would like, a farm visit and go over your poultry housing, your processes that you have, even how often you may move a mobile chicken tractor, as far as, you really should wait 6 months before getting back on that from a food safety biosecurity standpoint, or harvest it with other animals. But I would be glad to help you, look at what you have, where you're starting, and see what your goals are. Something just come to mind here about eggs that a lot of people may not follow as well as they should, but you need to collect eggs 24 or once every 24 hours. And you only should be collecting from nest boxes. If you're going in the barn and you're like, Susie Hen lays up there every day and you're getting that egg, the one day that some other bird lays or you missed an egg and you've got either from a food safety standpoint or somebody cracks open one with an embryo, that one bad experience, they're not going to come back and buy your eggs. So keeping those records, like I say, if you get in that habit, birds are very easy to train as far as here's when I'm going to collect. And, most of them will lay long before then, you'll know. In the summertime, when the heat gets up, even up here in the mountains, we don't get super hot, but collecting twice a day, and then getting those eggs cooled. And you need to make sure any eggs that are in storage are below 45 degrees. So if you're waiting to go to the food hub, and you've got 2 weeks of eggs setting on your counter, that is not good practice. Yes, April.
Hey, Thanks so much for the information. I have a question on, it's probably not allergen related, but kind of going off of just what you're talking about as just regulations in general. If I have eggs and we're talking about direct to consumer, what if there's a middleman, such as a store that they're reselling the eggs, or even in the market program where it's not necessarily direct to consumer anymore, there's a middleman there. So what is that?
And that's a great question. And what that happens is you need to make sure that you invoice and keep a record of that invoice to who you sold to. But then they become part of that food safety chain, and grocery stores understand allergens and how to handle them and are supposed to be following that. And so if something would come back, as the Department of Agriculture, USDA would be coming in to investigate, you having, when you delivered those eggs, what the dates of your collection were, and that is essential. And that's one reason I think the Food Hub is even here, because how they handle things, you've seen the pictures, they make sure those egg cartons are underneath. All of those goes back to food safety. So, and then asking the store or who you're selling to, do you know about this? Do you, what is that? And working together, I think we can make, the food system safer. But basically you having that invoice is going to release you from what happens from that day forward.
And you can sell direct to restaurants and grocery stores under the 30 dozen exemption. And restaurants are very aware of food allergies as an issue and how to manage those. Or they should be, at least.
There's always an exception.
Mm.
Okay, Christopher. Let's see. That's a very good question. I encourage you to wash eggs as you harvest that are dirty, because the longer contamination sets, it does two things. It allows that bacteria, remember, eggs are porous, and so it allows that bacteria to go deeper onto the shell. And then it also makes a weak spot in your shell. It weakens that as that dries on there. And I don't know if it is, I don't think there's a regulation that doesn't say you can't wait 3 days and wash your eggs. I would want to go ahead and get anything that had visible manure or dirt on washed, and maybe, to me, that's what I like. That's what you should eat. And you sell the nice ones you didn't have to wash, unless you're grading eggs, and then you do have to wash them, to that consumer. So you kind of take away any of that risk.
And you don't really want to refrigerate dirty eggs, right?
Right, absolutely.
Like you don't want to collect your eggs that need to be washed and keep them cold and then bring them back out and wash them, because that increases the risk of any of those contaminants getting pulled through the pores of the shells into the egg.
And the next thing, think about, it just brought up a great point, Chris, is what are you collecting in or storing those in? If you're storing them in the container and then you're taking them out and washing them and then putting them back in the same container, what have you just done? You didn't accomplish much. So, I do encourage, wire or plastic buckets to collect in. The wire ones, the first floor operation I worked in, I used to have 2 of them on each hand and collected in plastic flats, and we would do, stacks of dozens of eggs. But those were the only things they went to, was just collecting. And so making sure that your equipment, and you're not having cross contamination from collection equipment to your storage equipment. So, having that separate. Water would only push it through if you're using some type of pressure on it. And any of those dirty eggs, you do need to be using some type of a additive to the water that is going to neutralize that. And I can get you what those suggestions are. And it's not like those eggs just soak everything up, or that you should be putting eggs in a bucket or a bowl of water. You should be holding them, washing them. There's a procedure you go to. And that outer layer that gets slimy when you add water to it, I'm not sure exactly to tell you what that name of that is, but that is a protective layer. And that's the reason that we can unrefrigerate eggs that we don't wash that off of. And so any eggs that you're washing need to be stored, by the consumer differently. And so make sure, your consumers know that below 45 degrees is what's recommended for really any egg. What I tell people is, and for me personally, and I use fresh eggs, I still put them in the refrigerator because I'm not one just to set them out to say, okay, this is an experiment to see if I'm that one in, 620 billion people that's going to now end up dying from an egg set on the counter. So, to me, I like eggs that are washed. It's just a good food safety standpoint. And probably one of our safest foods that we have if handled correctly. Well, I know Jess is going to share my contact information, and if you have any further questions, please, reach out to somebody. We are here to help you. I'm proud of the food system we have in the high country. I was reluctant to tell the story about the eggs, and I won't say the farm or the restaurant, but I can tell you both are very, very popular in the food system in the high country. So it does happen. And so, any prevention and great biosecurity, not going to another chicken farmer and wearing the same clothes or the same shoes. Keep something separate that you just wear on your farm. Taking care of your birds, if you've ever experienced, total flock that you have to either get sick or, you lose part of them, it can be devastating. And on the question on there, April, it is all eggs should be refrigerated after that, 1 day. So, it's like you can leave your butter out all the time and the fat, but it's still a food safety thing. So there's some things there that can you do that? Yes. But if we're talking about eggs and all that you're selling, you need to make sure that the consumer understands how you're storing them and what your principles are. And also, especially from Extension's perspective, what is those, research-based information of what is the best food safety?
And refrigeration is also a quality issue too. So in terms of eggs aging.
Thank you guys so much. Does anybody else have any questions? All right. Well, it seems quiet. So, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Any thoughts on the amount of time for travel eggs should be out? Is there a recommendation between fridge to fridge? Is there also a recommendation for kind of after you've washed them, egg handling and drying them, you know, there's a process to get them back into the fridges. Is there amount of time for that as well?
I don't know that there's any recommendations per se of washing to refrigeration. I think the quicker the better you get those cooled down. And that is more from a quality standpoint. Refrigeration doesn't necessarily, well, it doesn't kill any disease. But it does keep that egg's quality up. And so your inner membranes last longer when that's really your protection. On the transportation, you know, 45 degrees. And so, you know, if you're going 20 minutes away or an hour away, putting them in a really good cooler, even without any ice or anything in there, they should maintain, you know, the temperature that you've taken them out of.
Great, thank you.
And if you're selling at farmers market, there are creative ways to get around not get around, but to display the fact that you have eggs for sale without having all your eggs sitting out on the table, right? So you can have a big stack of empty cartons or some nice pictures of eggs, and then keep your eggs cold in a cooler and just pull them out when a customer buys them.
Well, I'm glad I joined you guys. And if there's no other questions, I'm going to go out and get me an evening walk in.
All right. Thanks,
Thanks so
Eddy.
much. All right,
Well, thanks, everyone.
oh, go ahead.
Nope, I was just gonna say thanks.
Sorry.
Anyone
Zoom
has
is the worst.
questions, be in touch.
Yeah, I'll send out the notes and a recording of this if y'all want to go back through anything else. Of course, feel free to stay in touch with us. You can always email me or Taylor too at the Food Hub if y'all have any other questions about Farm Share or just the program going forward, what this summer looks like in terms of funding and things like that. But I look forward to seeing all of your allergen control plans soon. Feel free to get those submitted whenever they're done. And yeah, we'll be in touch. Thank y'all.
Have a good night, everyone.
Bye.